think everyone's got this VM up right now. All right, I'm just going to have you start the thing up. We're probably not going to get to it for quite a while, but at least in the previous class, we were having issues where the zone alarm firewall that's installed wouldn't allow you network access until it had been sitting there for a while. So at the thing, rather than pressing play, let's do the revert to snapshot, which is this double backwards arrow. And that should get you into the saved state where it was sort of. So originally the point was, well, and if it says there's different features, just go ahead and hit yes. So originally the point was to get you into a saved state. The point of running VMware Server is that had you downloaded this and just pressed play to start it up, it would have got you into the saved VM state where there's Notepad open and there's debug view open and stuff like that. This was because there were some changes. You know, there was not as many as I would have liked, but there was at least one change here where if you would have restarted the VM before you had looked with appropriate tools, you wouldn't have seen the change that was made to the system. It's not actually a malicious change because, like I said, I was having some issues with conflicting rootkits where they would not want to play well with each other. Surprise, surprise. So we're just going to let that sit so that by the time we get around to it, it should be prompting you to let you access the network. Sorry about that. All right. So the initial theme of this is check yourself before you wreck yourself. Right, so here's the Ice Cube lyrics, and I didn't know any of the further of the lyrics other than the refrain here, to check yourself before you wreck yourself. But when I looked into it, you can see that clearly, what is it again? Ice Cube? Yes. Ice Cube is is singing this from the perspective of a rootkit, but he's advocating for anti-rootkit detection. So his perspective of rootkit because he says he's bad for your health and he comes real stealth. But if you know the correct places to search for rootkits, you'll find them. All right, so like my previous classes, this is going to be all Creative Commons. So all of these slides will be public released. All right, so I have a few people in here that haven't had my classes before. So just to say a little bit about myself, I'm a generalist. I consider myself a computer security generalist, not a specialist, although over the last couple of years I've been focusing on host-based security type things because I feel that there's plenty of people who know network-based security, but there's not enough people who know deep host-based security, and we're left with network-based intrusion detection systems which have known problems where they can't find, they can't inspect encrypted content and all that. So it was an interesting way that I got into looking at rootkits. It was because I was working on a project, the MITRE Honey Client project, which is a client-side honeypot where the point was a normal honeypot, the attacker comes to you, they break into your system, and the system has no point except to be broken into. And with a client honeypot or honey client, it just runs around spidering the web, going to websites, waiting for them to break into the client just by viewing the website. And so I had done the kernel monitoring component for that. It was basically just, the problem was they had been using basically just scripts that would check the file system, check the registry, and those were taking forever. And so I integrated a third-party thing called Capture, which used some kernel monitoring capabilities in order to see all the file system activity, all the process activity, on all the registry activity. And one of the people on the project had kept misdescribing that monitoring of the system as a rootkit. He kept saying, yeah, we've got a rootkit installed on the system, and that's how we're watching everything that happens. And so someone else who was shopping around an idea for hiding a detection system had come to me and said, hey, I hear you know about rootkits. And I was like, well, okay, first of all, that thing that you were told was a rootkit, that's not a rootkit. But yes, I've been paying attention to rootkits off to the side for a while. So. All right, and then Xeno is mostly made of 4 elements, and every living thing is mostly made of 4 elements. Plants, bugs, birds, bees, bacteria, and men are mostly carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. That's to keep me humble and keep you humble. you're not so complicated. You're mostly 4 elements, and you're mostly empty space by volume. All right, so this is our agenda. More thing in less sections essentially here, unlike the previous classes where I filled up all 4 sections. So the miscellaneous for this class, like the other classes, is when you have a question, ask it immediately. Just, don't even bother raising your hand. Just shout out question and go for it. It's important to ask your questions as soon as you have it. Otherwise, if you get lost, I understand that some people will, if you have a question, you'll just sort of try to think about it and puzzle it out. You think that, additional context will help you understand it. But definitely in this sort of class, we keep moving fast, we keep going low level, so it's important to ask questions, even if it's just to reiterate what you think I just said. And as with the other classes, browsing the web and checking email is a great way to get lost here. I frequently have in other classes, the one person who, they're trying to attend the class, but they're busy, and then they're just checking email throughout the entire class, and then they end up coming multiple years in a row. So we're going to go with 2 hours here at the beginning, and then a 10-minute break, and then 2 hours to lunch, and then 1 hour breaks thereafter. So while I've got your energy and attention, we're going to try to push forward and get through a lot of material. All right, so what is the point of this class? So as opposed to some of the previous classes, which are a lot of background material which leads up into this class, the exploits class, the reverse engineering class, they were sort of more fundamentals, and that they didn't have a large component of hands-on material to it. So the point of this class was to try to take some of this background material and start applying it practically. So that's one of the big reasons why I wanted you to first have hands-on experience before class, because still there's a ton of material I have to get through in order to feel I've given you an adequate, even just a breadth first search of the material. So having come in, played with the tools, just whatever you got off of Google, that's good to get you thinking about what type of stuff you might see. I mean, most people through most tools would have caught Hacker Defender and potentially Vanquish. Vanquish was sort of half installed. It was installed, but it was broken because Hacker Defender and Vanquish were sort of fighting over who got to hook what. And so I think most of you would have seen that Vanquish was not even hiding itself in the main VM. I think if you restarted, it might have fixed itself in some cases, and then Vanquish might have disappeared. But that was one of the things I was trying to go for with the if you restart, system will change. I was originally trying to get Vanquish running because I knew if I install Vanquish and then I install Hacker Defender, if I restart, Vanquish breaks. But then sometimes if you restart again, Vanquish starts working. So anyways, you already had a little bit of hands-on experience from doing the homework. And so now we're basically going to go through and say, here are the tools I recommend due to, their enhanced detection capability. They're looking in more places than these other tools. And so you'll be able to see more of the stuff we talked in the class. Yeah, so that speaks to the sense of what you learned from the tools. And also, this is going to reinforce what we learned in previous classes for those who had them. It'll definitely, these first few things we're going to talk about where we say, run this tool, see these results. We're then going to say, this result relates back to intermediate x86. This result relates back to life of binaries, things like that. Yep, and so unfortunately in this class I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into things like attribution of changes. But, so I said for the homework I wanted, what changes were made maliciously to the system, what caused the change, and how can you remove it. On the what caused the change side of things, there were various ways you could approach that. You could do something like, trying to remove stuff, and if a change goes away, okay, well that file is related to that change. So that's like the first order attribution of changes which you could go for. Some of them get much more complicated. They require actually going in, looking at the location that's being targeted by a change, and then starting reverse engineering the actual assembly at that location. And we're not going to have enough time to get into that. But I do have some examples of that written up. So one of the class materials that I'm going to be distributing is a couple class materials. So you're going to get the all the slides. You're going to get a Excel file that has a comparison of different rootkit detectors and what they do and don't detect. So this was sort of useful exercise to go through. So here's a bunch of different types of changes that I potentially see, and then here's a bunch of rootkit detectors or things like Windebug, and whether or not they, green is detects it, and I was very generous here in detection in that I said it detects it even if you have to know specifically what you're looking for, and that's why Windebug gets high green marks, because in some cases there is no way to find something other than to go in, debug the system, and look specifically, did they change this data structure on this list somewhere. But Virus Block Ada is a newer anti-rootkit tool, which I'll talk about later, but that one, I found that like the Friday before the previous class. I mean, Virus Block Ada was the company which found Stuxnet actually, and so since then they've been bootstrapping this anti-rootkit tool in order to, so they can really claim expertise in rootkit detection, right? We found Stuxnet, and here's our super awesome rootkit detector. Prior to that, Gmer was my favorite due to some of its removal capability, and it had reasonably broad detection capability. But VBA basically is surpassing that now, especially in the removal area. So the green is just detects it. Blue is detects it and can potentially roll back changes. So when I was talking about how can you remove changes to the system, some of these tools can roll back the changes where the changes are something that should be one fixed value, and if you change it away from that fixed value, then they can say, well, I know what this should be, so they can roll it back, and you can do that without rebooting in many cases. Now, it may blue screen your system in some cases, but it at least has the capability. So that's another material you're going to have in this class, and so you can go out and find those tools and play with them as well. And then the other thing is a TiddlyWiki, which is a sort of standalone. Let me have it open. It's a standalone little JavaScript in a standalone file, and where I was going was I have some examples here of reverse engineering rootkit changes. So say ambiguous Gmer report 1, it says, okay, here's a bunch of changes that we see on the system, and it's saying, this particular entry points at that address, but it's not telling you what module that address pertains to, because it turns out that's on dynamically allocated memory in the kernel heap, essentially. And so it's like someone allocated memory on the heap, and they put some code there, and this points to that code. But the question is that good guy code or bad guy code? It turns out in this case it's good guy code, but the point of this is to show how you have to look at the things. So we say, attach a debugger, investigate the memory location, and then here is how you actually have to reverse engineer it. So we can't get into this level of depth. This was going to be an example for the reverse engineering class that's in May. We decided that this was too in-depth for intro reversing, so maybe an advanced rootkits class in the future, maybe an advanced reverse engineering class. Probably not the malware class, which is going to follow on to the reverse engineering class. So you'll have that as well, and also useful is getting a VM set up. This is sort of like instructor materials for, since I make these available, I want other people to be able to recreate the classes. But this is useful in that you can see all the bat file that I executed in order to install all of the various things. So I removed a couple of things which were conflicting and causing crashes and stuff. So there's a couple of rootkits that were going to be in this class. They were causing crashes. I removed them from this. You'll potentially see them in a future sort of optional just activity thing, not a homework or anything, but I'm going to put out a VM after the third class in June, where it's going to be a little more stealthy installation of some things. So this VM, the intent was just scattershot install as many rootkits as possible, and the next VM is going to be, how can we make it a little more stealthy, and it'll still be using techniques from this class, but perhaps their persistence mechanisms and things like that will be less obvious and therefore not, point immediately at specific files. So that's another of the class materials you're going to get at the end. And so when I distribute the class materials, I don't want them given out to anyone. I don't want you talking about them the class with anyone who's going to be in future class. So we've had just now, we had one McLean section, we're having this section, and then there's going to be, there were too many people registered, so there's going to be another section in June. So if anyone comes sniffing around, talking about, hey, how was that Rootkits class? I mean, if it's your managers, they're probably not going to be in the June section. But if someone from McLean comes sniffing around saying, hey, what'd you learn in the Rootkits class? You might want to consult with me as to whether they're in the class. All right. So, like I was saying, we're not going to be able to get into, deep attribution, which is definitely necessary in some cases. But like I said, first order attribution is often just go ahead and remove some file that you think might be causing the change. If the change goes away, okay, that's responsible. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the textbook here. You all got a free textbook for this. If you already have this textbook, please give it back to the MITRE Institute so they can just forward it on to the McLean class. I know some people already have this. But I want to talk about the pros and cons of various textbooks here quick. So 2005, this one, Rootkits by Greg Hoagland and Jamie Butler. The pros of that book were that it's written by Hoagland and Butler, who are two of the people who were contributing a lot to the early techniques of Windows rootkits specifically. But the con of it is that it's starting to show its age, and it's not particularly broad, and it's missing many newer techniques and things like that. Also, in some cases, they're definitely coming at it from an OS internals perspective, so they assume you're someone who's already understands things about how Windows OS works. And so if you don't know that sort of thing, it kind of goes a little fast into some of that material. That said, that book, when combined with the Windows internals book by Microsoft, definitely works good to complement each other. 2007, Professional Rootkits. This one, the good part about it is that it builds up an increasing capability rootkit. So they start with, just a very simple thing, and then they add network, and they add, hiding registry and stuff like that. So it's good in that it builds up as it goes through the class, and also it specifically has a code base, and it shows a lot of the code as you go along, and it shows what they added and things like that. But the cons is that it basically adds nothing new to the field. It's just reiterating stuff that's out there. And also the types of things that they're using in this book is not necessarily the most stealthy of techniques. They're just sort of I would say they're the more stable techniques, but not necessarily the more stealthy ones. So it's Professional Rootkits is a good name. It's from a professional whatever series, but Professional Rootkits is a good name in the sense that it can be used to make, rootkit functionality built into commercial software, like when there was the Sony rootkit where Sony had DRM that hid files in order to try to prevent you from, copying the CDs or whatever it was doing. That type of thing is exactly the kind of stuff that this book talks about. So if you were someone who's, charged with DRM creation, you might use techniques from this book. So this is what we eventually went with for the class. Rootkits Arsenal. The good thing about it is that it covers more things than the Hoagland-Butler book. It covers all the same stuff that the Hoagland-Butler does, but it covers more things, and it does cover it with an eye to Windows Vista compatibility. It comes with a lot of code, but the code is something that, at least last time I checked, someone can correct me if they find otherwise, but last time I checked, you're not allowed to actually go download this code anywhere. It's all just in that appendix at the end, and so you have to type it up again, which is kind of pointless. It's like, does he really think that he's saving the world by writing out a bunch of rootkit code and then saying, aha, but only the attackers who type it up will be able to use this? Well, I think really just stopping defenders from playing with it as well. Yeah, so I still have this in here. I need to go really nail that down. The first time I looked through this book, I was not particularly hot on it because I immediately found an example which to me looked like it was plagiarized from somewhere else. I have not been able to re-find that, so since this is going on the internet, I will not officially claim there's plagiarism until I actually go find the exact code. But But yeah, definitely in some, I remember at least in some cases, there were things like in the C code, normally when you're dereferencing a pointer in order to access a structured field, you would use, like the arrow sign, dash, and greater than sign. And all of this code is sort of rewritten in that it uses star and dot, which is the exact same thing, but using two operators instead of quote one. And that was kind of one of the things where I remember the first thing I saw, I went and I looked at this rootkit.com file, and there was the dash one, and then I went and looked at these things, and it was star dot. So anyways. All right, so it's sort of a pro and sort of a con here in that this book also, the author comes not from an OS background like Hoagland and Butler, but from a forensics background. So sort of thinking about, well, he was tasked, he was a forensic investigator, he was tasked with, finding the rootkit files on a compromised system post-analysis, right, not on a running system. And so he comes at it from a slightly different perspective, and so you get actually some extra material in there for anti-forensics and how you would actually hide on a dead system. But I kind of consider anti-forensics its own entire field. So, I mean, that's good if you've never seen anti-forensic stuff, but otherwise it just kind of feels like it's padding out the book. So between the appendix and the anti-forensic stuff, the book ends up not being super much bigger than the Hoagland Butler book. All right, finally, 2010, there was Hacking Exposed from the Hacking Exposed series, Malware Rootkits. It's good in that it's up-to-date reference, and it's good in that it talks about lots of in-the-wild stuff. So they talk about Mebroot and Rustock and other, named malware families that are in the wild. It does, a good job in that, well, so rootkits, I don't know why I would put this as a con. I guess the pro is that it does a decent job of talking about the general techniques. I would say it doesn't talk about them to the depth of the Hoagland Butler book. But the con is that it actually is still not a lot of material. It's only like 120 pages. So there's still a lot of just general malware to the book. And it's about that thick. So again, it's thinner than this. It's and only like 120 pages plus 34 detection. And the big con I considered was that when they talk about detection, a lot of it is sort of that unactionable, like, always verify your system files and stuff like that. And the other con is that there wasn't source code. So overall, I went with this Rootkits Arsenal book because there's source code, it's broad, and that's the primary reason, I guess. Okay, so what is a rootkit, but more importantly, how do I define a rootkit for this class? So it's definitely an overused term, and it's misapplied to a lot of places. But for this class purpose, we consider it an attacker tool where it's not how they get root, it's not how they break into a system, but it's how, once they're in the system, they hide themselves. So they've compromised root, or they've just compromised the system, and they want to maintain their privileges on the system, maintain access to the system, and hide themselves on the system. So I did sort of like this Greg Hoagland definition from his 299 track article, where he says that rootkit is a programs which patch and Trojan existing execution paths within the system. This violates the integrity of the trusted computing base. So it definitely is the case that a lot of the rootkit attacks focus on integrity level attacks. So therefore, when we go to detection, doing file integrity, memory integrity, things like that, we'll find a lot of the rootkit things. And even some of the other techniques, which are arguably not necessarily integrity-based, they still kind of fall along the lines of semantic integrity, meaning they may not be just, this value should be this, and if it's ever different, that's bad. It can be things like this list should have the same number of elements as this list, and so the way the operating system uses these lists, the integrity condition is that, they have the same number of elements or something like that. So a lot of it is about hiding, a lot of it is about integrity attacks, and to a lesser degree, a lot of it is about persisting on the system. So I think in a different forum, I'd focused on there's hooking, hiding, and persistence. But all right, so there's two sort of taxonomies here. The first one is ring-based, and so as we talked about in intermediate x86 class, we know that Rings are sort of privilege levels on the operating system. And so ring 3 is user space, it's the least privileged, and ring 0 is kernel space, and that's the most privileged. But then there are these, and for purposes of rootkits, this sort of talks about what level of privilege the attacker has. So there are user space rootkits where they don't actually need to compromise the kernel, things like that. User space rootkits typically rely on things like process and DLL injection, where for every process that's at the same privilege as you, they can just inject code into it through various Windows mechanisms, and then they can just use API hooking, either inline or import address table. They just use hooking within the thing in order to redirect control flow to say, if you try to read the file system, they're going to intercept that and hide files. And so they can do that entirely at the user space level. They need not necessarily go to kernel. Kernel level is obviously, the attacker would like to be as privileged as possible so that the security tools don't have more privilege than the attacker. And so they can attack the security tools. And so kernel-based is sort of the common one. I don't know whether you'd say which is more common in the wild, but that's definitely what we're going to focus a lot on in this class. So ring -1 is that in x86 they added the support for hardware support for virtualization, and that's sometimes talked about as if it were a ring -1 because when you add in a hypervisor, to virtualize an OS, that hypervisor is more privileged than the OS, the guest OS that it's controlling. And therefore, it's sort of like a ring -1, right? If ring 0 is more privileged than 3, if you're going towards lower numbers to get more privilege, then ring -1 is more privileged than 0. So a hypervisor is more privileged, and there's been rootkit talks that focus on either compromising an existing hypervisor or adding a hypervisor where there was none in order to get the attacker into a position where they're more privileged.
These negative rings, how do they deal with hardware?
Right, so the negative rings are not real rings in the sense of segmentation or anything we learned about in the intermediate x86 class. Ring -1, it's just sort of, Intel added in hardware, and I don't think they officially call it ring -1 anywhere, but the point is when you go into the manuals and you look at, how everything gets set up, the support for the hardware support for virtualization is such that it makes it so that even code which is running ring 0 will still be intercepted by this hypervisor code. It can intercept instructions, and it can control the memory access of the ring 0 code. So ring -1 is the closest thing to a real, actual ring here. It's just sort of a de facto ring -1 because when Intel added hardware support, they put a layer underneath the ring 0. All the rest of these are just sort of notional terms, and they're just for taxonomy purposes to say, here's where things are, lower, lower, lower. It's in between these levels inside of this privilege. So sort of the point is, no matter where you are, the lower you are, the more everything else above it you can subvert, right? So by going to ring 0, you subvert all of the ring 3 process. So if there's security software in ring 3, but you're ring 0, they don't really have any hope of, manipulating you or detecting you or anything like that. If you go to ring -1, then maybe it's much more difficult for ring 0 code to actually detect you. All right, so ring -1.5, which is just a term that I'm making up for purposes of this class to give a little more fine granularity. Ring -1.5 can be something like a master boot record infecting rootkit. So master boot record is the first sector of your hard drive, and it's code where after the BIOS is done loading, it grabs the first sector of your hard drive. So because it's immediately post-BIOS but pre-OS and pre-hypervisor, let's say you have a hypervisor which starts at boot up. You've got like a thin bare metal hypervisor, you're running ESX or something like that. Still, your BIOS is going to run, it's going to grab the master boot record, it's going to start executing it, then it's going to execute potentially the partition boot record, and then maybe eventually it'll kick off ESX. So with either an OS or a hardware bare metal hypervisor, in either case the master boot record always runs first. And so in these bootkit type attacks that we'll talk about later, the attacker sort of hops his way through memory in order to compromise things at the time that they get loaded so that he could manipulate your OS before you start the code of the OS, and he can manipulate, if you have a bare metal hypervisor, same thing. It's really functionally equivalent. He can just manipulate it before it actually kicks off. And so similarly, I put DMA in there. I've been sort of moving this around in my slides. I just changed it right here. So DMA is direct memory access. This is where peripherals can reach out and speak to the North Bridge, which is the chip which mediates all access to RAM. So even the CPU has to talk to this North Bridge to talk to RAM. Similarly, other devices, for instance, on the PCI bus or FireWire bus, are allowed to go talk to that same North Bridge to access memory. And so any peripheral which has DMA access can potentially be ring 0. I mean, I guess you could think of it as ring 3 as well, but it's most likely to be, you can think of it like ring 0, ring -1, or ring -1.5. And that means it can go up to ring -1.5 if, and only if, something like Intel VTD is not being used. This VTD is their code name for, what is it, IOMMU, Input Output Memory Management Unit. It's sort of a capability where you can lock down and restrict access to certain portions of memory. So in a proper configuration or in a properly designed hypervisor, the hypervisor should be using something like VTD in order to lock down its own memory so that it says external peripherals may not write to the hypervisor memory. Right? And that's to protect it from stuff like DMA, where if someone plugs in a FireWire device, FireWire can just speak directly out to the North Bridge. And so there were a bunch of attacks talked about since around 2004 where, if someone puts Linux on an iPod, they stick it into, they plug it in via FireWire. That Linux OS on the iPod can speak over FireWire and directly access the memory of the system, the physical memory. And that physical memory gets mapped to virtual memory, and that virtual memory can be being used for user space processes, the OS itself, and, or a hypervisor. So if your little iPod can reach out and rewrite any of the hypervisor memory, that means it's functionally more privileged than ring -1, right? But if the hypervisor is being correct and locking it down, saying no one may ever use DMA to access my memory, well then, the attacker may only be ring 0 privileges in terms of what they can modify. Similarly, an OS can use VTD in order to lock out, say there's no virtualization in play, an OS can lock out a peripheral from writing to its own memory, but if it's not, then functionally the DMA access is at ring -1 because you can change anything in the kernel. So that's where I'm putting that right now, and it definitely is a caveated thing. It all depends on whether these things like VTD are actually being used, which I guess Zen does use it, for instance, in order to lock down the hypervisor memory space, but I don't know about other things like VMware. I think it does, but I'm not sure. All right, so system management mode is a dedicated mode of the x86 processor where it's meant to be used for system management type events, meaning things like you've got a little heat sensor on the motherboard, and so when it fires off an interrupt saying, hey, the CPU is getting too hot, there's some code which is supposed to handle that immediately, turn on the fans, and let the system resume. And so that's one of the intentions for use of system management mode. It's to handle that sort of thing. The thing is, system management mode is sort of privileged in the sense that people are calling it ring -2 because the code which executes in system management mode is allowed to be locked down. So there's, when the BIOS is executing, it basically puts some code in a memory region and says, I'm going to treat this like the SMM code, and then it's going to execute whenever this certain system management interrupt occurs. And when the BIOS does that, it can also set a register that says, lock this memory down, and no one should ever be allowed to access it except the SMM's code itself. And so the reason it's considered like ring -2 is because if the BIOS says lock everyone else out of SMM, then that means a hypervisor is not allowed to read the memory of SMM, and an OS is not allowed to read it. But the SMM is allowed to read, all of physical memory. So it's like SMM can access all of physical memory, which means all of the OS's memory, all of the hypervisor's memory, but the hypervisor and OS are not allowed to read its memory just based on this locked state. So that's why SMM is considered ring negative 2, because it can, modify all that stuff above it, but they can't modify it. All right, then going lower, ring negative kind of 2.5 is BIOS or EFI, stands for firmware interface. So newer systems use EFI, or Macs use EFI, and older systems use BIOS. And so the point of BIOS or EFI, it's a sort of firmware where immediately on system reboot, your CPU gets set to a default state, your north bridge gets set to a default state, your south bridge gets set to a default state. The north bridge, again, is the guy who mediates all access to RAM. South bridge accesses all of the slower peripherals that aren't connected to the north bridge. So, John, what's an example of something like that? South bridge sort of thing. What are some of those buses on the south bridge?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a low pin count where the BIOS actually is. What about like PS2? Is that down there?
I don't know about the
Yeah, I don't know either. I can't remember any of the slower stuff. But basically, slower stuff is typically on the south bridge, and the fast stuff is on the north bridge. But the BIOS, when your system gets reset, it's reset into a state where the CPU accesses a specific memory address as the first instruction that it's going to execute. But because the north bridge and the south bridge are reset, that memory, that quote, memory access where it's trying to look for an instruction, that just gets redirected down the north bridge, and instead of going out to memory, well, I'll drop it real quick. Did you want this? All right, so when your CPU gets reset, it's looking for, trying to look for instructions at FFFF0, this memory address. But these things get reset so that whereas normally the north bridge would say, oh, you're looking for that, memory address. Okay, I'll redirect you out to RAM and you can go and read that memory address. But when it's in a reset state, for that specific address range where that resides, it basically redirects it down through the north bridge, goes to the south bridge, and the south bridge redirects to the BIOS. So that the very first instruction that the CPU executes, it reads in from the BIOS, which this BIOS memory gets, it's, quote, mapped to memory, but it's more like all of the memory accesses are mapped to the BIOS. So the CPU gets instructions from the BIOS, it starts executing them. The BIOS is then, supposed to do the initialization of the system. It's supposed to check whether you even have any RAM installed right now. It's supposed to go out and initialize peripherals, and eventually, when it's done, it goes and it says, "Okay, guys, I'm done. You can, cancel that out. You don't have to redirect me anymore, and you don't have to redirect me anymore. So, stuff can go back to RAM." So that's the BIOS's job. But the reason why we consider this more privileged than system management mode, for instance, is because inside of the BIOS is, a little bit of code, this system management mode code, where it takes that and it puts it in memory and it sets all the relevant bits to say, okay, this is going to be the instructions which are used when a system management interrupt occurs, and then I want these locked down. So basically, if you control the BIOS, then you control system management mode, and system management mode can control everything else. So just a cascading sort of effect there. And similarly, the BIOS reset, when the BIOS is really totally done, it goes and it reads the master boot record in from disk, and it just goes ahead and passes off to that. So same thing where controlling the BIOS, you could manipulate the master boot record data before you pass control to it, and then do the equivalent of a bootkit, but without having to change the stuff on the hard drive. So that's why the BIOS is sort of ring negative 2.5. And finally, ring negative 3, chipset based. I'll go back to this picture. Chipset based is actually where you're subverting this north bridge here. And so I said that, for instance, the SMM gets put into RAM in a certain location, then you lock it down, quote, lock it down. But the thing that actually does the enforcement of locking is the north bridge chipset, which is the thing that says, is someone trying to access the SMM? And then they say, is this the SMM itself? No. All right, disallow. Or, the PCI is over here. and this is trying to do DMA. This is trying to do DMA to talk directly to this RAM and read data in and out. Again, controlling this controls that capability, controls the SMM lock, things like that. So I'll show a quick picture of that later. But Intel has a technology called active management technology, and what they've actually done is they've implemented. So this Northbridge is actually a completely separate CPU. Well, you can call it a CPU or just a microprocessor or whatever you want to call it. Whereas this is the x86 thing that we talked about in all these classes. This is a separate kind of chip called an ARC4. And so with this active management technology, Intel has actually made this quite a bit more complicated in that it has, so out here on the PCI bus, you've got your network interface card and stuff like that. And so this AMT code actually knows how to talk directly to the NIC on, this specific Intel CPU, or sorry, this particular, specific Intel motherboard combination of NICs and Northbridge and CPUs and all that. AMT knows how to talk to the NIC, and so it allows, there's sort of, I can't remember them all, but there's sort of like 3 levels of capabilities for AMT. One is you go into a, full shutdown sort of state. It's ostensibly full shutdown in that you shut down your CPU and it's no longer executing code. This thing is completely powered off. But this thing is still powered on, and this thing can still receive commands over the NIC. And this is meant to be used by remote administrators where, let's say this entire lab of machines is turned off for the weekend. There's an emergency patch and we must, install ASAP, and the administrator just wants to get it over with. He knows it's going to take, 2 hours or something. So he comes in and he uses AMT, and he can actually go talk to all of these and turn the things on. So this isn't like wake on LAN. So we know that wake on LAN is just where the NIC is sort of, where the system is kind of sleeping and it will resume from a sleep state. This is like actually the CPU is powered off, but the NIC and the AMT are still sort of running, and they're still just consuming a little bit of power on this special ARC4 processor. And so you can actually say, okay, turn this thing on. And then you can do things like, after the thing is into a turned on state, then you can start doing things like, okay, mount the CD and start, an install process and stuff like that. So it's meant for remote administration and stuff like that. Okay. And I think you'll start seeing some more use of AMT come out of the McAfee Intel merger. Sort of one of the many points of that was, hey, Intel said, hey, we've got all these sort of security technologies and other things that we're putting into hardware, but no one's using them. So let's buy a security company and, highly encourage them to use our techniques and give them, full documentation and everything, and then they'll start using it. But anyways, there's a talk that we'll show just one quick slide from later about subverting AMT and getting attacker code to be able to run in the context of that processor, and therefore, obviously, you can control SMM and control DMA and control all of the hypervisor's memory and OS's memory and all that. But of course, for each of these things, it's worth saying that as you go lower and lower in this picture, you're obviously removing a bunch of abstractions from yourself, right? So in user space, you've got all these libraries that are given by the kernel. So, you just call create file and it just happens magically, right? If you go lower into the OS, well, you've still got create file equivalents in the OS. Go into the hypervisor, maybe you've still got something that's more limited. You're not maybe reading a file system of guest OS. Maybe you're just reading full guest OS files at a time. But you start getting into, master boot record, and you have to start reading the hard drive sector by sector and putting together files. And pretty much everything else from lower down, system management mode, it doesn't know what a process it is. It just knows here's a block of physical memory. I better, look for some strings in that I think is related to data I want to compromise. So it's worth saying that in each of these things, you go way down low. It's harder to detect them. And they potentially can, and that means they can potentially persist for longer. But they also have much more complicated implementation requirements because they've removed all of the abstraction layers, and therefore they must build those abstraction layers, at least targeting the specific thing. So if they want to send a packet from the chipset, well, in AMT's case, it may be easier because it's already meant to send packets from the chipset. But other places like system management mode are not necessarily meant to do that. So you have to write your own driver that talks to the specific hardware and all that sort of thing. So you go lower, it's harder to detect, but it's harder to build. It requires more expertise, and you have less abstractions. All right. Any questions on this before I go on? This is just one sort of taxonomy here in terms of the lower you go, the more privileges you have. You can control pretty much everything above. Any questions on that? Yes.
Do we see stuff in the wild with all of these negative ring metals?
No. So most of them are just sort of proof of concept things that have been talked about in Black Hat talks and stuff like that. I'm not even sure if we've seen ring negative 1 in the wild. I can't think of any examples of that. Doesn't mean I just haven't been looking for it or paying attention. And I'll come back to that later. Bootkits we have seen in the wild, absolutely. So ring negative 1.5. We do see bootkits in the wild. But things like system management mode and BIOS, well, BIOS, theoretically, anything there. That's all I'll say. Any other questions? All right. So that's one level of taxonomy. This is another by Joanna Rakowska. And so this was sort of trying to get around the issue of, the fact that rootkit means many things to many people. And so instead she's just saying, let's focus on, so you can see how rootkits fall into a stealth malware taxonomy because I said that rootkits, as far as I'm concerned, they're about hiding the attacker on the system. So that's about stealth, right? But there's different ways that you can hide on the system. And there's different capabilities you're going to be using. So type 0 means you're only using legitimate features on the system and you're not changing anything about the system at all. And so well, I'll get into each of these in more detail in 1 second. So type 0 just uses whatever functionality is there. It doesn't change anything. Just potentially hides in plain sight, essentially. So if I've got a file hidden deep in the system and the administrator doesn't know to go look for it, well, that's potentially stealth malware, right? Type 1 then is malware which modifies things on the system, in the operating system, to hide itself, but it modifies things which should be static. So it means that's sort of like what I was talking about when I was showing those detectors. Some of them can roll back changes for different categories, and that's typically this if there's type 1 type changes. So the malware comes in there, they say, I want this function which usually always points at, this function pointer which usually always points at the core operating system, N2S kernel.exe or something. They say, I want that to point at my code instead. But because that should always be pointing at N2S kernel, it's clear that that's a sort of static thing, and modifying that will be fairly easy to detect. Type 2, on the other hand, is where, malware people started recognizing, for each rootkit person who came out with a new proof of concept technique, they saw pretty quickly that, okay, well, when I describe this to you, you now can just go look for it, right? So they started saying, okay, what about, can I change things which should be changing naturally? So they're just, maybe there's many possible states for something. Maybe there are things which, are being created and destroyed and stuff like that. And maybe I can manipulate that in order to still achieve my stealth malware goals. And then, therefore, the defender can no longer just say that should be this fixed value. And then it makes it much harder on the defender in order to find that type of malware. And then finally, type 3 is something where it exists actually outside the operating system. And so where she was going with this is that this was 2006 was around when she was coming up with the idea for the ring negative 1 rootkits, where she was saying, I want to use the hardware support for virtualization, and I'm going to actually jump outside the operating system. I will be a hypervisor, and then theoretically I will control everything that goes on in the guest OS, so you should never be able to see me. Right? And that's not actually the case, but that for purposes of this taxonomy, if you're sort of really outside of the place where the defender should be looking, it's sort of more about if the defender is looking for operating system subversion, if you're somehow completely outside of the operating system, then that's one way to be stealth, right? You're still maybe manipulating the operating system from the outside, but it makes it harder for the defender there. All right, so some examples of type 0 malware are things like spyware, Trojans, bots, things that hide in plain sight. So you say, if it's these capabilities don't necessarily focus so much on the hiding aspect of things other than the last one, but it's just worth saying that, you know, for something like a botnet, if it has the capability to do a DDoS attack, there's nothing illegitimate about the ability to open up a network socket and send some packets, right? It's only when, you know, you send it at maximum rate and when it's combined with a bunch of other stuff that becomes something we consider malicious. But it's just using functionality built into the system. So really, where the stealth side comes in is the hiding in plain sight. So, and you know, Stuxnet is actually a good example of this. So Stuxnet kind of, it's a few different levels here, but the driver files for Stuxnet were like mrx net.sys, I think, was one of them, and something else, mrx class. I can't remember which one's legitimate, which one's not. The point was, on a normal Windows system, there are things like mrx smb.sys. That's like a legitimate Microsoft file. But Stuxnet named itself like a legitimate Microsoft file and just put itself into the services to start up like a legitimate Microsoft file. And so it wasn't actually trying to hide itself there on disk or anything, gambling on the fact that, you know, it looks like just another thing. And as most of you saw with your homeworks, if you run rootkit detector and you're hiding your files, that, you know, shows up as a big red flag very easily. So in some cases, it may be better to actually be type 0, just try to blend in with the system rather than change anything about the system. Now, they did hide the exploit files and stuff like that on the USB disks. They were hiding those files, but not actually the service which persisted on the system. All right, so detecting type 0 was basically out of scope for the taxonomy and also for this class. When something is actually just sort of hiding in plain sight and not actually changing anything about the system, well, that comes back to where you kind of have to know what should or shouldn't be on your system, right? So, you know, some of these sort of things can help with that. There's, you know, obviously antivirus can find known things that shouldn't be on your system. File system integrity checking is, you know, the flip side. That's sort of whitelisting, where you're saying, I'm going to take everything that I think should be on my system, put it in a list, and anything new that gets added, I need to check that. And so, you know, that sort of thing would have found Stuxnet at 2 levels. It would have found that the new addition of those system files would have also found their Trojaning of the DLL later on. But, and then there's also behavioral analysis and things like that.